Welcome to Mr. Beebop. Peril at End House is a work of detective fiction by British writer Agatha Christie, first published in the US by the Dodd, Mead and Company in February 1932, and in the UK by the Collins Crime Club in March of the same year. The book features Christie's private detective Hercule Poirot, as well as Arthur Hastings and Chief Inspector Japp, and is the sixth novel featuring Poirot. Here are some interesting facts and trivia about the novel.
Book dedication.
The book's dedication reads, "To Eden Philpotts, to whom I shall always be grateful for his friendship and the encouragement he gave me many years ago." In 1908, Christie was recovering from influenza and bored, and she started to write a story at the suggestion of her mother, Clara Miller. This suggestion sparked Christie's interest in writing, and several pieces were composed, some of which are now lost or remain unpublished. These early efforts were mostly short stories, but at some point late in the year, Christie attempted her first novel, Snow Upon the Desert. She sent it to several publishers, but they all rejected the work. At Clara's suggestion, she then asked Philpotts to read and critique both the book and other examples of her writing. He was a neighbor and friend of the Miller family in Torquay. He sent an undated reply which included the praise that, "Some of your work is capital. You have a great feeling for dialogue." In view of her later success in allowing readers to judge characters' feelings and motivations for themselves, and in doing so, thereby deceiving themselves as to the identity of the culprits, Philpotts offered valuable suggestions to leave your characters alone, so that they can speak for themselves, instead of always rushing in to tell them what they ought to say, or to explain to the reader what they mean by what they are saying. He gave her further advice in the letter regarding several suggestions for further reading, to help improve her work. Philpotts gave Christie an introduction to his own literary agents, Hughes Massey, who rejected her work, although in the early 1920s, they did start to represent her. Undaunted, Christie attempted another story, now lost, called Being So Very Willful, and again asked Philpotts for his views. He replied on February 9, 1909, with a great deal more advice and tips for reading. In her autobiography, published posthumously in 1977, Christie wrote, "I can hardly express the gratitude I feel to him. He could so easily have uttered a few careless words of well-justified criticism and possibly discouraged me for life. As it was, he set out to help."
Literary reception.
The Times Literary Supplement, on April 14, 1932, stated that the actual solution is quite unusually ingenious, and well up to the standard of Mrs. Christie's best stories. Everything is perfectly fair, and it is possible to guess the solution of the puzzle fairly early in the book, though it is certainly not easy. The review further opined that, "This is certainly one of those detective stories which is pure puzzle, without any ornament or irrelevant interest in character." Poirot and his faithful Captain Hastings are characters whom one is glad to meet again, and they are the most lively in the book, but even they are little more than pawns in this problem. But the plot is arranged with almost mathematical neatness, and that is all that one wants. In the New York Times Book Review, on March 6, 1932, Isaac Anderson wrote, "With Agatha Christie as the author and Hercule Poirot as the central figure, one is always assured of an entertaining story with a real mystery to it. The person who is responsible for the dirty work at End House is diabolically clever, but not quite clever enough to fool the little Belgian detective all the time. A good story with a most surprising finish." From Robert Barnard. A cunning use of simple tricks used over and over in Christie's career. Be careful, for example, about names. Diminutives and ambiguous male-female Christian names are always possibilities, as readers discover. Some creaking in the machinery, and rather a lot of melodrama and improbabilities, prevent this from being one of the very best of the classic specimens.
References to other Christie works.
2 references, in chapters 1 and 5, are made to the events told in The Mystery of the Blue Train, and it is clearly stated in chapter 1 that Peril at End House takes place the August following Poirot's trip to the French Riviera, described in that book. In chapter 9, there is a remark in passing on the cleverest type of crime, which later became the theme of Curtin, Poirot's last case. At the beginning of chapter 14, Hastings describes how Poirot's obsession for tidiness helped him solve a case when he straightened ornaments on a mantelpiece. This is an indirect reference to the mysterious affair at Styles. In chapter 15, Poirot mentions the case The Chocolate Box, included in the book Poirot's Early Cases, when he tells Commander Challenger that he indeed had failures in the past. In chapter 16, Inspector Japp asks Poirot if he had not retired to grow marrows. This is an indirect reference to the failed attempt at retirement, depicted in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, when Poirot settled in the small village of King's Abbot, only to be prompted to investigate a murder in the village.
Synopsis.
Poirot and Hastings vacation in Cornwall, meeting young Magdala Nick Buckley and her friends. Nick Buckley was an unusual name for a pretty, young woman. But then she had led an unusual life. First, on a treacherous Cornish hillside, the brakes on her car failed. Then, on a coastal path, a falling boulder missed her by inches. Later, an oil painting fell and almost crushed her in bed. Upon discovering a bullet hole in Nick's sun hat, Hercule Poirot decides the girl needs his protection. He and Hastings meet all her friends at her home called End House. Though he aims to protect Nick, he begins to unravel the mystery of a murder that hasn't been committed yet.
Characters.
End House estate and regular guests. Nick Buckley, young mistress of End House. Commander George Challenger, friend of Nick Buckley. Frederica Rice, Nick's best friend. Jim Lazarus, art dealer and a friend of Nick. Bert Croft, Australian man renting the lodge at End House. Mildred Molly Croft, Bert's wife, disabled due to a car crash. William Wilson, gardener at End House. Ellen Wilson, housekeeper at End House, William's wife. Alfred Wilson, Ellen and William's son. Investigators. Hercule Poirot, famous Belgian detective. Captain Arthur Hastings, Poirot's friend. Chief Inspector James Japp, Scotland Yard detective. Colonel Weston, Chief Constable of Cornwall. Other characters. Dr. Graham, local doctor. Charles Weiss, solicitor and cousin of Nick Buckley. Hood, porter at the nursing home whom Poirot interviews. Dr. McAllister, Commander Challenger's uncle with a practice on Harley Street in London. Maggie Buckley, Nick's cousin who comes to visit. Nicholas Old Nick Buckley, grandfather of Nick Buckley, lived at End House with Nick until his death. Michael Seaton, wealthy adventurer and pilot who goes missing.
Adaptations.
The story was adapted into a play by Arnold Ridley in 1940 and opened in the West End of London at the Vaudeville Theatre on May 1. Poirot was played by Francis L. Sullivan. A Soviet film version, entitled Zagadka and Kaza, was made in 1989 by Vadim Durbanev. The novel was adapted for television in 1990 as part of the series Agatha Christie's Poirot. It was the first full-length novel to be adapted. Poirot was portrayed by David Suchet, and Nick Buckley by Polly Walker. Overall, the film was faithful to the novel with some minor changes. Colonel Weston had been omitted from the adaptation, and Miss Lemon was added. This episode was also filmed in Salcombe, Devon, near Agatha Christie's hometown of Torquay, rather than on the Cornish coast where the story is set. The novel was adapted as an episode of the Japanese animated series, Agatha Christie's Great Detectives Poirot and Marple, under the title The Mystery of End House. It aired in 2004. The novel was again adapted as the fourth episode of the first season of the French television series Les Petits Murders d'Agatha Christie, airing in 2009. The episode was called La Maison du Peril, and was only loosely based on the original story, removing the character of Poirot entirely. Peril at End House was adapted for radio by Michael Bakewell for BBC Radio 4, featuring John Moffat as Poirot, and Simon Williams as Captain Hastings. On November 22, 2007, Peril at End House, like Death on the Nile, was adapted into a PC game by Floodlight Games, and published as a joint venture between Oberon Games and Big Fish Games, with the player once again taking the role of Poirot as he searches End House and other areas in Cornwall coast for clues, and questions the suspects based on information he finds, this time through the clue cards he gains on the way. Peril at End House was released by HarperCollins as a graphic novel adaptation in 2008, adapted by Thierry Jollett, and illustrated by Didier Quellegio.
International titles. Did you know?
The novel featured allusions to actual history, geography, and science. Transposed from Devon to Cornwall, the majestic hotel of the book is based on the Imperial Hotel in Torquay. In Chapter 7, reference is made by the characters to a female aviator who went to Australia. This is an allusion to Amy Johnson, who made the first solo flight from England to Australia by a woman, from May 5 to May 24, 1930. The attempt by the character Michael Seaton to fly solo around the world is a key element in the novel. At the time of the novel's publication in 1932, the feat had never been achieved. In 1933, Wiley Post became the first aviator to circumnavigate the globe. Thank you for watching. See you again next time.